Have you ever found yourself wondering why love at times feels like a burden? Why does it seem that to be loved, you must constantly give more, do more, and slowly forget about your own needs along the way? Maybe it's something you were taught early on, that to be a good spouse, a selfless parent, a supportive friend, you had to sacrifice yourself. That your worth in relationships depended on how much of yourself you were willing to give up. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere along the road, you lost track of where you ended and the other person began. If that sounds familiar, you're not alone. Many of us, especially those of us who grew up in a time when duty and responsibility were drilled into us from a young age, carry this silent rule inside us. Love means sacrifice. But today, I want to talk to you about something. Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and brilliant mind behind so many insights into the human spirit, challenged us profoundly. He believed that sacrificing your true self in the name of love wasn't noble. It was dangerous, not just to your happiness, but to the very possibility of a real, lasting connection. Let's take a moment and breathe, because this might be uncomfortable. We've all done it. You put your partner's needs above yours. You work extra hard to keep the peace, even when you're deeply hurt. You smile when you're breaking inside. You say yes when every fiber of your being wants to say no, all because somewhere deep in your bones, you were told by society, by family, by experience that to be loved, you had to earn it through sacrifice. But here's the thing. Real love, the kind that nourishes, the kind that lasts, doesn't ask you to disappear. Carl Jung spoke of the self as something sacred, not something to throw away. He believed we each have a unique essence, a center, a truth that makes us who we are. And when we abandon that truth in the name of being accepted, we don't just betray ourselves. We begin to form relationships based on illusion, a mask, a performance. And that's a lonely place to live. Have you ever looked in the mirror and thought, I don't even know who I am anymore? That's the voice of the self softly crying out to be remembered. I remember a woman named Martha. She was in her 60s, a retired school teacher, warm and generous. She'd been married for over 40 years. Everyone thought she had the perfect marriage. But one afternoon over tea, she said, almost in a whisper, I don't think he's ever truly known me. I asked her what she meant, and her eyes welled up. I've spent so long being who he needed me to be, who my children needed me to be, that I forgot who I was before all of them. There was no anger in her voice, just sadness. And the quiet realization that while her life had been full of love, it had often been a love that required her silence. This is not an uncommon story. What if I told you that being truly loved doesn't mean disappearing into someone else's expectations? What if, instead, it means showing up fully with your desires, your boundaries, your truth, and allowing another person to meet you there? Jung believed in something he called individuation. It's the process of becoming who you truly are, not what others expect you to be. And when we stop sacrificing ourselves for the sake of belonging, something miraculous happens. We start forming relationships not out of fear of being alone, of being rejected, of not being enough, but out of authenticity. We begin to love and be loved as we are. Think of it like this. When you constantly water someone else's garden while neglecting your own, eventually, your well runs dry. You start to feel resentment, bitterness, exhaustion. And the worst part? The person whose garden you were tending may not even notice because they never asked you to give that much. Or worse, they've come to expect it. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't care for the people we love. Of course we should. Love is generous. Love is kind. But love is also honest. And sustainable love doesn't ask you to empty yourself. There's a quiet kind of courage in saying, this is who I am. This is what I need. And I matter too. Sometimes we fear that if we stop sacrificing, we'll lose the love we've worked so hard to keep. If we put ourselves first, even once, people will leave. But let me ask you this. If someone only loves you when you're bending over backwards for them, is that love? Or is it dependency? Is it a habit? Is it convenience? True connection starts when we stop trying to be everything to everyone and start being honest with ourselves. This isn't about selfishness, it's about wholeness. Because you can't give love from a place of emptiness. You can't support others if you're constantly running on fumes. And you can't expect someone to love the real you if you're hiding the real you away. Have you ever had a moment, maybe in the quiet of the night, where you imagined a different version of yourself? One that didn't always say yes. One who spoke up. One who laughed louder, cried freely, danced without shame. That version of you is not a fantasy. It's the self calling you home. And here's the beauty of it. It's never too late to listen. Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That doesn't stop at 25 or 35 or even 65. Many people only begin to hear that call once the noise of life quiets down, once the children are grown, the job has ended, the roles you played for decades start to fade. That's when the real work begins, the work of coming home to yourself. And as you do, you may find something extraordinary. The people who truly love you will still be there, maybe even more drawn to you, because there's something deeply magnetic about authenticity. It invites truth, it invites depth, and it invites a kind of love that doesn't require sacrifice, but celebrates presence. You might feel unsure at first, setting boundaries, saying no, admitting that you have needs too. But each time you honor your truth, you reclaim a piece of your soul. And in doing so, you make space for love, real love to bloom. There's a moment, sometimes subtle, sometimes seismic, when you realize that loving others never had to mean losing yourself. For many people, this moment comes quietly, like a light bulb turning on in a room that's been dim for years. And for others, it comes in the middle of a conversation, an argument, or even in the silence after a deep disappointment. However it arrives, that realization is powerful. It can shift the way you see your past, your relationships, and your future. Carl Jung's work reminds us that the greatest journey isn't out into the world, but inward, toward our true self. And when we dare to take that path, we don't just find ourselves. We find out what real love looks like. Imagine being in a relationship where you can speak your mind without fear of judgment, where your no is just as respected as your yes, where you're not performing or pleasing, but simply being, and that's enough. Doesn't that sound like freedom? Like peace? Now, think about the times you've held back. Maybe you didn't want to cause trouble. Maybe you thought it was better to stay quiet, to keep the harmony. You told yourself, it's not worth it. But those little silences add up. And eventually, they become a wall, not just between you and others, but between you and yourself. Jung believed that every time we ignore a part of ourselves, we push it into the shadows. But those shadow parts don't disappear. They wait. They show up in our dreams, in our moods, in the little irritations we can't explain. And often, they show up in our relationships, especially when we feel unseen, unheard, or misunderstood. So what happens when we bring those shadow parts into the light? When we acknowledge our anger, our sadness, our longing, not as flaws to be hidden, but as signals from our soul, that's when healing begins. There's an old story about a man who spent his whole life carrying a heavy sack. He never looked inside, just dragged it everywhere. One day, someone asked him what was in it. And for the first time, he opened the sack. Inside were all the pieces of himself he thought were unlovable, his fears, his dreams, his disappointments, his unmet needs. As he looked at them, he realized they weren't ugly. They were simply his. We all carry that sack. Some of us were taught to put everyone else first, to be the caregiver, the peacekeeper, the one who never complains. And while those roles may have served us, even protected us, they also cost us. They cost us our voice, our joy, our sense of self. But it's not too late to lay that sack down, to stop carrying the belief that your worth is tied to your usefulness, your sacrifice, your silence. Love that demands you shrink yourself isn't love. It's control. And love that only flows one way from you to them, never back, will eventually leave you empty. That's why Jung placed such importance on inner integration. When you bring all of yourself to the table, your light and your shadow, you create space for relationships that are based on truth, not performance. And here's the most incredible part. When you stop sacrificing yourself to be loved, you deepen your capacity to love others. Because now, your love isn't coming from fear or obligation. It's coming from wholeness. Let's talk about boundaries, because this is where many people get stuck. Boundaries are not walls. They're bridges. They don't separate you from others. They protect the connection by making it honest. A relationship without boundaries is like a house with no walls. It might feel open, but it's also vulnerable to every storm that comes. When you set a boundary, say, "I'm not available to talk right now," or "I need some time for myself," you're not being difficult, you're being clear. And clarity is one of the most loving things you can offer, both to yourself and others. Still, many of us were taught that saying no is rude, that asking for space is selfish. But ask yourself this: would you ever tell your best friend that she's selfish for needing rest? For wanting respect? Of course not. So why would you treat yourself any differently? Self-respect is the root of all healthy love. And that starts with listening to your own needs, not pushing them aside, not pretending they don't exist, but honoring them. One man I once spoke to, Robert, had spent years bending over backwards for his adult children. Every time they asked for help, money, babysitting, or errands, he said yes, even when it drained him, even when he was exhausted. He thought he was being a good father, but deep down, he felt used, invisible. One day, he finally said, "I love you, but I can't do this today." He was nervous, guilty, but something amazing happened. His children respected it. They adjusted. And for the first time in years, he felt like a person again, not just a helper. That's what reclaiming yourself looks like. It's not about withdrawing from others. It's about showing up as your full self. And when you do that, you permit others to do the same. It creates a ripple effect, more honesty, more compassion, more mutual care. Sometimes the hardest part is letting go of the roles that once defined us. The caretaker, the fixer, the one who always holds it together. These roles might have helped us survive, but they're not who we truly are. Who are you when no one needs anything from you? What brings you joy, not just comfort? What makes you feel alive, not just useful? These are not selfish questions. These are soul questions. And it's never too late to ask them. Jung taught that the journey of individuation, becoming fully yourself, isn't just for the young. It becomes even more vital as we age. Because in later life, we are finally free from many of the obligations that once consumed us. The mask can come off, and in its place, the true face can emerge. You've spent years loving others. Now it's time to include yourself in that circle of care. That might look like saying no without guilt. It might mean spending time alone without explanation. It might even mean disappointing someone, not out of cruelty, but out of truth. Because love built on lies, even small ones, can never truly nourish us. Only love rooted in authenticity can do that. And as scary as it might feel to change the dance, to stop overgiving, to start telling the truth, the reward is deep. You begin to experience a different kind of love. One that sees you. One that stays. One that doesn't demand a performance but invites your presence. You are not too old to change. You are not too late to begin again. You are not unworthy of a love that respects your whole self, your dreams, your limits, your heart. All of you are worthy. And the more you believe that, the more your relationships will shift. Some will fade, yes, but others the right one. So will flourish. Because real love, the kind Jung described, doesn't ask you to disappear. It invites you to be seen. There's a quiet beauty in reclaiming yourself. At first, it might feel unfamiliar, maybe even a little uncomfortable, like stepping into a room you haven't visited in decades. But as the dust settles and the light begins to pour in, you start to notice something. That room, that part of you, was never truly gone. Just waiting. Waiting for you to return, not with shame or apology, but with open arms. Carl Jung spoke often about wholeness, not perfection. He understood that the goal of life wasn't to become flawless, but to become real, to become integrated, to no longer exile the parts of ourselves we thought were too loud, too needy, too messy, because those parts, the ones we've been taught to suppress, are often the very keys to our aliveness. So, what does it look like to truly break away from the belief that to be loved, you must sacrifice yourself? It looks like walking into a room full of people and knowing you belong, not because you've earned it or because you've molded yourself to fit, but simply because you are there. It looks like saying yes with joy and no without guilt. It's the peace of no longer second-guessing yourself after every conversation. It's choosing to spend your time in ways that bring you energy, not just obligation. It's realizing that love doesn't require you to be less. It celebrates when you become more. You might be thinking, that all sounds wonderful, but is it possible at my age? And I'll tell you what I tell everyone who asks that question, regardless of whether they're 30 or 70. Absolutely, yes. There's something uniquely powerful about doing this work later in life. You have wisdom now. You've lived through things that once felt impossible. You've seen how life can change in an instant. And perhaps most importantly, you've come to understand what truly matters. You don't need to rush. This is not a race. You've already been running for others for years. Now you walk gently, steadily back to yourself. Maybe that means having a conversation you've been avoiding. Maybe it means writing a letter you'll never send, just to get the words out. Maybe it means waking up tomorrow and doing one small thing differently, drinking your coffee slowly, taking a walk alone, saying no when every instinct says, just say yes to keep the peace. Each small act of honesty is a thread, and day by day, those threads begin to weave a life that feels like yours. And I want to pause here and say something incredibly important. It's okay if this brings up grief. Grief for the years you spent trying to be enough. Grief for the version of you that was always tired, always accommodating, always hoping that if you just gave a little more, they'd love you back the way you needed. That grief is real. It deserves space. And it's not something to be rushed or glossed over. But don't let it harden you. Let it soften you. Let it open you. Because on the other side of that grief is freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when you realize that the only person you ever truly needed to be was yourself. That's what Jung meant when he spoke of individuation. Not becoming someone new. But finally, after all these years, you become fully yourself. And when that happens, something else begins to shift. Your relationships start to reflect this new truth. The people who once depended on you to always say yes may be surprised, even resistant. But the people who truly love you, the ones who see your soul, they'll adjust. They'll grow with you. Some relationships will deepen. Others may fall away. That's okay. That's part of the process. Not every connection is meant to last forever. But the ones that remain and the new ones that come will be based on truth, not transaction. You deserve that. You deserve to be loved for who you are, not for what you do, or what you give up, or how well you play the part. You deserve to rest, to dream again, to take up space in your own life. There's a kind of magic that happens when someone begins to live from their truth. It's quiet at first, like the soft cracking of ice before a thaw. But soon, it spreads. You walk differently. You speak with more conviction. Your laughter is fuller. Your tears are more honest. People begin to notice. Not because you've changed on the outside, but because you've come alive on the inside. And make no mistake, coming alive is contagious. When you stop sacrificing yourself in the name of love, you show others it's possible to do the same. Children, partners, and friends start to see you differently. Not as someone who exists to serve them, but as someone whole, vibrant, and wise. And in doing so, you invite them into a new way of loving too, one that is mutual, respectful, and deeply nourishing. So here we are, at the close of this conversation, but perhaps at the beginning of something much more meaningful, your next chapter. And no matter what your story has been, no matter how many times you've abandoned yourself for the sake of peace, you can begin again. Right now, today. You are not behind, you are not broken, you are not too much, and you are not too late. There's a whole world waiting for the real you to show up, not the polite version, not the agreeable version, not the endlessly giving version, but you. And the love that meets you there, that love is worth the wait. If this message spoke to your heart today, I invite you to take a moment and share your thoughts below. This space is a community, a place where stories matter and every voice counts. And if you know someone, friend, a sister, a partner, who needs to hear this message too, feel free to send it their way. Remember to like the video and subscribe if you'd like more content that supports your journey, your healing, and your joy. Because you deserve a life that feels like home. You deserve to be loved not for how well you sacrifice, but for how brightly you shine. Live fully, love deeply, and above all, never stop becoming more of who you truly are. Always with you, always cheering for you.